Welcome, everyone. I'm Shannon Dean, Chief Citizenship Officer for California Water Service. I'm pleased to be here today to be a part of this timely and important discussion. Before the housing crisis, before our current transportation woes, before tech, biotech, and fintech, California had water challenges. Following the first arrival of humans in California, it took 10,000 years for us to reach a population of 250,000. However, in the 170 years since the gold rush, we have added 40 million people and built the nation's largest agricultural economy and the 5th largest economy in the world, all supported by a vast system of dams, pumps, and aqueducts. In the face of longer and more severe droughts, tree die-offs, plummeting fish populations, and record wildfires, how can we balance competing demands for California's limited water supplies? Joining us for today's discussion is an expert panel representing some of the best thinking on water in California. First, Joaquin Esquivel is chair of the State Water Resources Control Board, responsible for preserving, protecting, and enhancing California's waterways and drinking water. Chair Esquivel was appointed by former Governor Jerry Brown and previously served as Assistant Secretary for Federal Water Policy at California Natural Resources Agency in Washington, D.C., and as a legislative assistant for former U.S. Senator Barbara Boxer on agricultural, Native American, water, and ocean-related issues. Also with us today is Michael Carlin, the active general manager of the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. SFPUC's regional Hetch Hetchy water system serves 2.7 million people across San Francisco, San Mateo, Santa Clara, and Alameda counties, and is the largest freshwater system serving the Bay Area. Michael supervises the agency's efforts in capital planning, emergency response, asset management, and other functions across the agency's water, power, and wastewater enterprises. Kate Poole is the Senior Director of the Natural Resources Defense Council's Water Division. Since 2004, Kate has served as lead counsel in important cases that have helped to reduce the impact of public works projects in California on threatened and endangered species. Currently, she leads the NRDC's work to protect and restore freshwater ecosystems at the local, state, and national levels. So thank you for being here. Joaquin, the Bay Area Council has a very active Water and Climate Resilience Committee whose members are total policy wonks. But for those in the audience who aren't deeply engaged in California water policy, I wonder if you could take a few moments to set the stage for this discussion. So from a 30,000-foot level, what does California's water system look like? And what have been some of the historic conflicts around its use?
Thank you so much. Really appreciate this opportunity, and particularly to join my fellow colleagues here in the state. We're at really a crisis moment when we look at our challenges because of climate change on our water systems, particularly right now with drought, but also in times of excess and flood. We see these extremes increasing, and candidly, our water systems were built for a century in a climate that simply no longer exists. So as we take our 20th century water systems that we've developed, and I think really important, and I appreciate the acknowledgement here at the start that these are systems that have been in place since time immemorial. These ecosystems, these water systems, ultimately natural systems that support what are our man-made systems that we've layered on top of them. And they supported about 300,000 California Native Americans here in this state for, again, millennia, a lot longer than we have been managing our resource now. And there is a history there. I think there is a collective history that we are all reconciling, where the mistreatment and certainly the vast impacts that we had on the indigenous people of California is something that we are still grappling with. And when you look at our water policies generally, is part of, I think, a theme of reconciliation, that we are inheritors of these incredible water systems, the Central Valley Project, the State Water Project, that move water across vast distances on our state and allows us to have a shared wealth, a wealth that was here and predated us and that we have all collectively benefited from. And it's not to say that we have to somehow go back to a point in time that we certainly can't turn the clock back, certainly not on the climate of this planet. But it does mean that we have to be serious and honest about the work in front of us, which is to reconcile this system, these 20th century water systems that we've built, again, for a hydrology that simply no longer exists, and that we continue to see have had impacts on ecosystems throughout the state. So going back to that history, we can just see that what has contributed to our ability to have wealth in this state, to have a stable population here of 40 million Californians, is our ability to move water around to our more drier parts of the state, but importantly, in ways that build resiliency to what are cycles of drought and flood that this state has always naturally been exposed to. And in fact, our water systems, although based on a hydrology that was a lot wetter back then, was built to take into account what are periods of dry conditions, drought, and then excess, and trying to create some certainty in our water systems and predictability when it comes to the timing of those deliveries for the purposes of putting to beneficial use, as we say in the parlance of water rights, for communities to grow food, to drink water, to be able to provide what we have. And I think what we often take for granted, which is that the water will always be there, that you will turn your tap and there is a dependency on or an assumption of the certainty of our supplies. And I think that what drought continues to show us, these challenges of climate change, are that we can no longer take for granted these systems, that it's going to require us to have a generational reinvestment in the way that we view them and really in building them out in general. So I say that knowing that much of the infrastructure that we all depend upon in our communities was built with great federal subsidy through the 70s and into then early 80s, but then tapered off, and that have shifted this question of affordability to all of our communities to maintain the systems that we have for our drinking water, very local systems ultimately, knowing that about 85% of all investment in drinking water, wastewater infrastructure happens at that local level. It's ratepayers, it's communities contributing and maintaining their systems. But we know again that those systems are strained already. We already have 1 million Californians without access to clean and safe water now. And that number is only threatening to grow as this climate challenge, as we are confronted with this climate challenge and droughts that concentrate contaminants in groundwater. And you may be a community that is meeting all drinking water quality standards, and then a drought hits and makes your primary drinking water source then more expensive to treat, and then affordability challenges throughout the state are what we see because of this. And so I think if as I try to do my best to sort of set the table, it is these common themes of reconciling a system that oftentimes you look at. I think of the Klamath dams with the incredible announcement, for those of you have tracked, from FERC, allowing that dam removal process to move forward in Northern California, where we built most of this infrastructure without consideration for the changes that it was making on the watersheds and the ecosystems that all of our economies are really dependent upon. I'm reminded always that the two words ecology and economy share in common in their Greek root, home. One is in reference to the running of that home, and one is the home itself. And you can imagine which is subsumed into the other, and is certainly our economy that is limited by the ecologies that they depend upon. And so we're having to reconcile that here in that moment, again, as we are challenged with climate change. And it's not simple, it's not easy, but we have institutions, thankfully, both importantly at local, state, and federal levels, that hopefully we can align ourselves, can really start to make this generational reinvestment in our water systems and start to actually address not just the 1 million Californians without access to clean drinking water now, but those that would lose that access but for a real reinvigoration in our water systems.
Great, thank you very much, Joaquin. So moving on, before we begin discussing the current drought, let's first discuss the last major drought, which lasted from 2012 to about 2017, and by some estimates was the most severe in our state's history. Are we more prepared this time around, and why? What did we learn from the last drought? Why don't we start with you, Michael?
Oh, thank you, Shannon. It's not just the last drought, 2012 through 2017. It's actually the drought of 1987 through 1992. It's the drought of 1976 through 77. There's lots of similarities between these periods of time. As Joaquin stated, I think important to remember, climate change has changed our perspective on how we look at these periods of dryness and how we need to be prepared for those periods of dryness. So for example, we have what we call a design drought, which is actually a stress test on our system. What happens over a longer period of time if you were in this dry period? How much water can you actually conserve? How much water can you actually make available, not just for people, but for the environment? And what projects are you doing to diversify your water supply in times of need? So it's not that you're just depending on surface water. You might be depending on groundwater. You might be working your groundwater with your surface water. You might be developing recycled water. You might be developing non-potable water for use in buildings for flushing toilets, which is something we do in San Francisco. So that when you do get into these situations, you have a resilient portfolio of water sources. And that's what we've really learned from all these different droughts. So we have become very conservative. People have said we've become overly conservative. But if you look at 76, 77, and you compare it to the past 2 years, the year we're in and last year, it looks very similar to 76, 77. Here's a little factoid. Back in 76, 77, we had very little water in Hetch Hetchy. Today, because of the way we operate, the way we conserve, because of the way that we have our people conserving water on a very personal basis, we have about 84% of the water in Hetch Hetchy today, which will take us through this year, next year, and the year after. So we have become more resilient because we've become more conservative. That's not to say that we don't need to pay attention to the environment. We have to, and we have to make water available for the environment. And we do that on a voluntary basis this year in the Lower Tuolumne River, where we're putting extra water down the Lower Tuolumne River just for the environment.
Great, thank you. Kate, what do you think? Did we learn from the last drought?
Thanks, Shannon, and thanks to the Bay Area Council for inviting me to be part of this panel. We did learn some things, but I would say in the most fundamental ways, at the state level, we are handling this drought so far exactly the way we did the last time around. And that's primarily because we failed to incorporate what I think is the primary lesson of the last drought, which is that we've got to plan for them and stop treating them as emergencies. As Michael alluded to, we've always had periodic recurring droughts in California. They're nothing new. The new part from climate change is that they're getting more extreme. And that just ups the need for us to make our system more resilient, as Joaquin said, and really reform the system that we have been relying on for decades to deal with this new scenario. But instead of sort of anticipating and planning for more frequent and more intense droughts, we're back in the situation where the governor's declared a drought emergency. And essentially what that means so far, just like the last drought, is that we're waiving environmental and water quality protections to get through the drought. And these waivers are going to cause massive fish and bird kills, possible species extinctions, an explosion of harmful algal blooms in the Delta. And, like the environment took the worst hit in the last drought, we're on track to have that same scenario play out again. What I just heard from both Michael and Joaquin is that we really need to up our planning game. And if we do that, we can reform operations of our system so that we enter droughts with fuller reservoirs. We can, improve conditions in the environment in non-drought times so that the environment's more resilient when we come into what we know is going to be the next drought. And we can also better manage the expectations of water rights and water contract holders so that they know to expect less water in drought. The way that we have operated the system now is that we've have water delivery contracts from the major water projects that essentially promise more water than has ever been delivered. And they promise that same amount in drought years as well as wet years. By some estimates, our water rights system allocates 5 times the amount of water that our system can yield. So it's not unreasonable with that kind of setting for people to expect a lot more water than they're getting, which just heightens the tensions and the conflicts in drought. And we really need to right-size those expectations so that people can plan for getting less and make alternative investments.
Great. Thank you, Kate. Joaquin, would you like to weigh in on this one?
Yeah, thanks. I will say that we need to be doing more, and we need to be moving faster and further when it comes to our responses to climate change, seen as just how quickly it is here before us. Regrettably, what we don't have the benefit of is a few more years between the last drought and this drought to really start to just kind of further accelerate and lean in on some work. But I will say that even though the last drought was only here, 5-6 years out from the thick of the dryness then, we do have some better response here. And I really do feel it is around data and information. And the importance there is turning that into better decision making. And so I agree certainly when it comes to the projects and the way they're run. We need that discussion further up in the water year when there are still opportunities on the table to understand and balance what are very complicated and ultimately, not easy needs that the projects all need to accomplish, but that we all in common are here called to balance. Again, our use of the water, ensuring that we're maximizing its benefit and helping us all collectively get through tight moments like drought. But again, back to this data point, I think that what we saw in the last drought certainly were over nearly 3,000 domestic wells that went dry in the Central Valley. And we have more data about the location of those now because of Sigma. We have more opportunity to engage with groundwater sustainability agencies as they help us respond and they themselves understand their groundwater resources, and as it diminishes the impacts to communities around drinking water. And I think, again, the key is let's ensure that we have this better data turns into better decision making. And that includes on the water rights side. That includes on the way that we administer how it is that we take water out from our watersheds and make it more real time, make it better pegged to what's hydrologically available, and create certainty both in the water user community, but for our communities generally as a state, as we respond to difficult conditions like drought, that we're not leaving anything on the table. And when we don't have basic data information around some of this critical decision making in drought, it makes it very hard to manage well through it. And I think there have been incredible advances quickly since the last drought, particularly around drinking water needs in communities with vulnerability to drought, but we need to continue to do better. And I continue to see just an incredible opportunity to ensure that we're using 21st century tools to address our 21st century climate crisis, and continue to see just opportunities at the board.
Okay, great. Let's move on and discuss the current drought. How bad is it for residents, ecosystems, and the economy? And what should businesses in the audience prepare for in the second half of 2021 and over the next few years? And why don't we start with Kate this time?
Thanks, Shannon. So speaking, primarily from the environmental perspective, it's already very bad for the environment. By waiving and reducing existing environmental protections, many of which are decades out of date already, we are likely to see the final death knell for Delta smelt, which is considered the sort of bellwether for the health of the Bay Delta ecosystem. We're on a path to wipe out most of this year's runs of wild salmon. Stockton and other places in the Delta are already seeing their waterfront turn acid green from harmful algal blooms, which will kill your pet if they go into the water and have long-term adverse health effects for people. So it's bad already, but we are also only in the first critically dry year of, several recent water years. So the poor rain and snowfall that we got this year followed a not so bad dry year in 2020, which followed a very wet year in 2019. So because of those decent prior years, we ended 2020 in the 2020 water year, which ends on September 30th, in pretty decent shape with our statewide reservoirs at 95% of average storage. But today, Shasta and Oroville reservoirs, which are our two largest reservoirs for the state and federal water projects, are both below 50% of average. So in 9 short months, we've basically drained our major reservoirs to what will likely be historically low levels by the end of the 2021 water year. So if we have a few more critically dry years following this one, which climate projections, estimate is pretty likely, we're going to be in big trouble, and we should be planning for that now, which means doing everything we can now to reduce our water use. And individual businesses and people can do a lot to reduce their own water use, but like climate change, this is really a systemic problem that requires a larger societal response. And so, what really needs to happen is that we need to follow the example of the Nevada governor, for example, who recently outlawed non-functional turf in Las Vegas. Landscaping water use remains about 50% of residential water use in California. And, watering grass to make pretty lawns is just not a priority use in times of shortage. We also really need to grapple with wasteful agricultural practices in the state. Agriculture uses about 80% of the developed water supply in California, and we simply can't afford to irrigate crops using inefficient methods like flood and furrow irrigation, which is still about 40% of our irrigation methods in the state, or to plant, permanent orchards, tree and nut crops that have to be irrigated every year without a firm water supply. We just need to declare those kind of uses unreasonable in an arid state like California if we're going to right-size our water use.
Okay. Michael, what do you think?
I think Kate made a lot of good points, and I want to point out one thing that most people wouldn't think about, but 2019 and 2020 were actually big wildfire years. We had numerous wildfires in the state of California, and people want to understand this, but when you have a wildfire, it kind of dries out the soil. So when we had the runoff this year, a lot of the runoff that we would expect to come into reservoirs got absorbed into the soil because there was just no moisture there. So where we run models every day, we were doing our predictions, and we just saw less runoff coming in just because of the number of wildfires actually that have occurred in California. And I think one of the other points that Kate made that I think is really important, outdoor use should be reduced. It just doesn't make sense to have ornamental grass and things of that nature in California. It's not the climate for it. So we've actually asked people to voluntarily right now to reduce their outdoor irrigation, since that is discretionary at this point. We want to make sure that people have enough water for health and safety and such. We also want to make sure that we have enough water for businesses to reopen after COVID-19. They've been closed down, people have been sheltered in place. There is a pent up desire to be out, to going out, to visiting these businesses, and spending your money and recovering the economy. We think that's really important. We want to help promote that, but do it in a wise and reasonable way. We're also studying, where we saw large office buildings close down. So we saw water use patterns change from the downtown area to the more residential areas in San Francisco, just because people were home all the time. And I think that's something that, we're going to see the shift back. But again, if we do things wisely, I think we can actually reduce the amount of water that people are using, not just during droughts, but permanently. And I think that's the important thing. All these changes should be permanent. They shouldn't be an emergency. We need to drive that home to people, because every drop you save today is a drop that you'll have tomorrow. I don't care if it's for you or it's for the environment. It's important that we actually do save water. So we want to make sure the businesses can reopen. We want to make sure people have sufficient water for their basic health and safety. And we want to make sure that, that people just understand that there is a need to provide water for the environment, as Kate pointed out.
Okay. Joaquin, do you have anything to add to that one?
Just to again hit home, I think what both Kate and Michael are saying about the real need to shift the way we view our water usage in the state and continue to incentivize the conservation and wise use of it. And I think back to my data point, I think the more that we, what we were able to get out of the last drought was monthly reporting now from our urban water agencies on water production. We can see in real time, if you will, as conservation efforts are put into place by agencies, what the response is. And so I think we have an opportunity to continue to be very data-driven in our efficiency discussion and really continue to see the outcomes we need to see collectively to increase our ability and already have example of it, right? I mean, California has led the way and shown that conservation allows you to decouple, especially in the urban and manufacturing side, the ability for an economy to grow and still use less water. And there again, the incredible example of the Metropolitan Water District adding well over 5 million people into their service area and still using then less water than they did in the mid-90s. That's because of investments in conservation. That's importantly though, because of a consciousness raising of Californians generally in the last drought to understand our very personal relationship with water, our habits that may form around it, and the need to really reflect the ethic that we have around water in the state, knowing that it will only continue to be a critical and dwindling resource, if you will, in the face of climate change, but that we can still maximize our usage of it, and it need not be something that harms our economy. And you saw that in the last drought as well, where you didn't see a dip in our economy or productive output because of the investments we've made. But those investments only get us so far, and there is a generational need here to reinvest and rethink of the way that we view our water systems, particularly in the face of conservation and particularly in the face of drought.
Okay, great. As everyone knows, affordable housing is a pressing issue across the state, particularly in the Bay Area. Just a few years ago, Governor Newsom said he'd lead the effort to develop 3.5 million new housing units that are needed by 2025. In response to the current drought, however, communities are considering slowing down or even banning new water service hookups. Obviously, we won't be able to develop new housing without water. How are we going to tackle these two challenges, insufficient housing units and water supplies, simultaneously? Michael, let's start with you.
That's a great question, Shannon. So I'm just going to be San Francisco centric about this one. We have a lot of housing in the pipeline to be built, and we're looking at those, and we've approved some of those through a water supply assessment tool that we use that's required under CEQA. And one of the reasons why we're able to do that is we have local ordinances for what we call non-potable reuse. So you take the gray water and black water that you generate from your house, and this is multi-house developments, large developments, and you basically recycle it on site and use it in your building to use all those things like flush your toilet or do your landscaping or whatever it is that you can do to reduce the amount of potable water that you use. So that allows us to move ahead with some of these housing projects because people in those housing projects are using less water in the future than they would today under just normal, circumstances. That's something we have to look at. It's a one water approach. You use the right water for the right reason, for the right, use. And, that's what we need to do in California, not just to use it once and throw it away, but use it over and over again so that we can actually do that. We can do that because we're great innovators. California basically is leading the nation in that sort of regard of non-potable reuse. And we're pushing the edge of the envelope, even in California, as we look at other ways that we can do it. Eventually, we will get to purified water. We will be taking our wastewater, I hate to say it, and purifying it and drinking it. And that is the future as well, because there's just, as Kate pointed out, all of the water in California has been oversubscribed. So we have to take care of what we have now, and we have to take care of it for the future as well. So we can do this and we can meet our housing goals.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Joaquin, what do you think?
I think that it needn't have to otherwise impact our housing goals, but it can if we're not being thoughtful about our water systems, to Michael's point, and really continuing to ensure that we're maximizing all of our potential, in particular with recycled water. And I would say that I'm excited to say that we will be drinking our wastewater. I think that when it comes to this next generation of investments, these are the 21st century water systems that we will be having. You see the incredible investment that the Metropolitan Water District is making in conjunction with the LA Sanitation District, and then also the leadership of the mayor to say we need to maximize what is otherwise just a resource that is being put to the ocean at this point. And with a little, and yes, we need to bring the public along, but I think Californians are there. You see that because the board in just the last years since the Prop 1 bond dollars came to the board, and we've been using the state revolving fund, we put out over $1 billion in loans for water recycling facilities throughout the state. And those investments are paying off. Those investments are creating resiliency in communities, and they can create drought resilient supplies for communities as they meet housing goals. But I think it's important to remember it's not just the water element that we need to keep in consideration when we think of housing and how we house our families and build our communities into the future ahead. It's also a matter of the other complicated factors that go into how you select a community and ensure that it's not subject to sea level rise, or that there isn't risk to flooding, or you're not filling in a wetland in order to build that housing. I think that there are ways that we can layer our considerations as we build housing for our communities here for the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years out into the future, that I think we need to have that timeline consideration of.
Great. Kate, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, I'm just gonna sort of give a me too. I mean, I totally agree with what Michael and Joaquin said about how if we invest far more heavily in local sustainable water supplies and demand reductions, we have plenty of water to meet our housing needs. You may have all noticed that Southern California is doing far better than Northern California in this current drought, and that's not because they got a lot more rainfall. It's because they really took this lesson to heart in that 1987 to 1992 drought. So they're 3 decades ahead of us in the Bay Area, really, in investing in more efficient water use, more water recycling and reuse. Orange County has the largest water recycling system in the world for indirect potable reuse. LA is making huge investments. San Diego's making huge investments in both recycling and urban stormwater capture. We are behind the ball game on those investments in the Bay Area. And, not only do we need to really up our game, but, it helps us to deal with drought. We're all flushing our toilets and running our dishwashers and taking showers in the drought. And reusing that water means we have more in these times.
Yeah. Okay, moving on. In 2018, the State Water Resources Control Board adopted new rules that require much more water to be left in rivers. This is known as unimpaired flows, to help stabilize fish populations like salmon and add other environmental benefits. But cities and water suppliers have pushed back, saying that cuts to urban water supplies to facilitate these flows are too great and will jeopardize water security for millions of Californians, especially given the pressures of climate change. But to make this question more fun, I would like to ask you to put yourself in each other's shoes. So Kate, put yourself in Michael's shoes. What actions should we take to improve the drought and supply resilience of California's major economies?
Well, you know, we just touched on many of them. Part of the lesson of drought is that the water supplies that we've traditionally counted on in California, you know, taking water out of mountain-fed rivers and aquifers, they're increasingly unreliable and insecure. Whatever your view of the need to restore our rivers, we can't keep relying on those systems to supply us the same way that they have in the past. So we gotta invest heavily in those drought resistant water supplies that we just touched on. That also gives us the ability to diversify our water supply and water management tools. And that is just simply more resilient than a single focused system. So as a PUC, for example, relies almost exclusively on supplies from the Tuolumne River system. And in a draft urban water management plan that it just published, it projects that in 2045, San Francisco would still be getting approximately 91% of its retail water supplies from the Tuolumne River. And that is not an aggressive enough path to water diversification that we need to see. And it also means that we're continuing to take, you know, 90% of the water out of the Tuolumne River in years like this one, which, you know, continues to have that river be on a path, you know, to a death spiral, essentially.
Okay, Michael, I'm going to have you react to that.
Am I supposed to take Kate's role?
Well, no, at this point, you just react and tell us what you see as maybe opportunities or obstacles to what she's just expressed.
Yeah, I don't think there's any obstacles to what she expressed. I think I need to correct the record a little bit here. Yes, we do get the majority of our supply from the Tuolumne River, but we also get 15% from local watersheds in the Bay Area, both Alameda and San Mateo. We do have a groundwater program with 3 other cities that we actually bank water for drought purposes, then we pump it out. Yes, we are building a recycled water plant in San Francisco, and it's not as big as Orange County, but we don't use 500 million gallons a day in San Francisco like Orange County does. It is only 4 to 5 million gallons a day, and it'll mostly do irrigation of parks. So we get all the parks off groundwater and surface water. We only use 41 gallons per person per day in San Francisco, and that's incredibly low compared to the rest of the state. And we're still going lower. We think we're going to dip below 40 at some point in time. But I also would say this, you talked about the Bay Delta plan. And frankly, I'm a big proponent of the voluntary agreements. I'm a big proponent of functional flows rather than unimpaired flows. I'm a big proponent of actually starting now and not waiting and then seeing what the fish tell us rather than waiting to have the perfect plan. The perfect plan will never get passed because people will always be resistant to it. I would start today doing the voluntary agreement if my friend Joaquin gave the thumbs up. I would even start if you even just held a hearing on it, to tell you the truth, and spend our own money and see what we can do for the river. Like I said at the top of this discussion, the lower Tuolumne River has a flow schedule. And during this period of time, that flow schedule was very low, as Kate pointed out, because basically it goes down to 50 cubic feet per second. We have doubled that voluntarily. No reason just to do that, to keep the river alive and flowing. And I think that's important as well. Acknowledge that people are actually doing something. I can't, as San Francisco, correct the whole Delta issue. That takes everybody. But I think, we do have a resilient, water portfolio in San Francisco. I think we have a good environmental ethic that we're trying to institute, corrections on the Tuolumne River. Let's try some things to see how it works out.
Okay. Now, Michael, put yourself in Kate's shoes and answer the question, how do you think we can recover iconic California fish species?
Now you get to be me, Michael.
Oh, Kate. Uh, like I said, I think we have to ask the fish. And I'm going to take a step back and say fisheries management in California is something that needs reform. You know, it's not just the native fish, you know, that we're targeting. We have, you know, a lot of hatchery fish in the system. We have to understand how they interact with the native fishes. But I think we have to create suitable habitat basically for the native fishes. And creating suitable habitat is going to take time. We need to restore the floodplains. We need to restore gravel beds. We need to have flushing flows. We need to have attraction flows. You know, we need all of those things to actually, you know, recover these species. And we have to manage those invasive species that we're introducing to California that outcompete our native species. That's one of the things I think that we need to do is look at how we do predator control. So there's lots of things that we should do. But again, start now, see what works. If it doesn't work, adaptively manage and do something else. But this just waiting to see what we can do rather than doing, I think is important. So that's the way you're going to recover our iconic species. I think that, you know, there is going to be a lot of work that needs to be done and a lot of people involved in that, but it can be done.
Okay, Kate, we have just maybe 1 minute for you to kind of react to what Michael has said.
I don't disagree with a lot of what Michael said. I just think the key issue here is that we take too much water off of these river systems. We need to leave more in there. Floodplains don't do any good if you don't regularly inundate them. Habitat does no good if it's not wetted. So, you know, I think that's where the fundamental disagreement is. And I think if we increased, for example, our efforts, our recycling efforts in San Francisco, then we could reduce our take on the Tuolumne River. And we could follow the example of San Diego and use put our recycled water in Crystal Springs and then save it for later use. That way we can get, you know, sort of win-wins across the board.
Great. In our last few minutes, I would like to give Joaquin an opportunity to weigh in. You've been at the center of this debate in recent years, obviously. How do state agencies like the Water Board weigh competing demands over limited but absolutely critical resources?
Yeah, thank you, Shannon. Are you sure we're not out of time?
I'm pretty sure.
No, I appreciate it. And I do appreciate the back and forth between Michael and Kate here. You know, I'll just say, so it's hard to do any justice to any true discussion or dialogue around the Water Quality Control Plan update and what we need to be doing here. Just a couple of notes. The last time the board updated the plan was in the mid-90s. And then I was in the 8th grade. And so I like to think there are a lot of 8th graders out there now that are really dependent upon us all to get this right. To not allow another several decades to go by, because we know we don't have those decades any longer, but at least any time go by at this point without really a common shared sense of urgency around the work. And the fact that the board last updated the Water Quality Control Plan in the 90s maybe speaks to, and the challenges in continuing to make sure that we have good momentum is probably hopefully evident to some folks that we need to just get serious about getting the update done. And I think this board, our board, the board that I've at the Water Board here that I've been part of, and even my time, and certainly in my time as chairman, have always been very clear. We are open to voluntary agreements, but again, to the sense of urgency point that we need to start to be acting sooner now, and that we can't repeat the same mistakes of the mid-90s. And again, the other point I would make is important to say that we're not talking about the Endangered Species Act here when we're talking about the Water Quality Control Plan update. We're not talking about, you know, legal terms like jeopardy. We are needing to see something, but often get confused, I think, the fights around the Endangered Species Act, the impact just to the projects, and what is otherwise actually a bigger project that we are looking at here in the Bay Delta. And going back to not repeating those mistakes in the mid-90s, you know, then it was well, it's too big of a project, and we're just going to have the State Water Project and the Central Valley Project meet water quality standards. We know that doesn't work. We need everybody to contribute collectively to this watershed, because the salmon don't experience the watershed as distinct, segments of liability between, individuals in this negotiation. It is important and incumbent upon us all to just remember the sort of outcomes that we're driving toward. And they're not just about endangered species here or saving one species. It is trying to say, how do we best look at this system a little more holistically for once, and be honest with ourselves again about the need for amounts of water that may be different than what people have been dependent upon or diverting for decades. And it needs to be different anyway, because climate change is making that all too real. So let's do so before and make those changes before our ecosystems slip out from underneath us as well.
Great, thank you. Thank you, panelists. We are out of time. Great discussion. Really appreciate your time today.
Thank you.